Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Alicia Menendez. I'm an anchor with MSNBC. I'm also the author of a book called The Likeability Trap. Welcome to our NBCU Academy live stream on advocating for yourself in the workplace, a topic that I feel very passionately about. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with Catherine Kim. She's our Senior Vice President of Global Digital News for NBC News and MSNBC. Catherine has more than 2 decades in the industry. She's worked on shows like 60 Minutes, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, and she was the executive editor of NBC News and MSNBC Digital 4.5 years ago before recently being promoted to Senior Vice President. That's an impressive resume.
Thank you.
Yeah. I do want to start where I think we sort of all are in this moment, Catherine, which is you are a member of a community that is under attack right now. And I imagine that you are also spearheading a lot of coverage around that. And I'm wondering, just as someone who knows you and cares about you, first, how you're doing, and then also how you're balancing those competing personal and professional demands.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. It's been both heartbreaking, sad, a really deeply reflective time for all of us. We've been focused on covering the rise of sort of xenophobia and anti-Asian bias along with the spread of along with the pandemic, the start of the pandemic. And I certainly feel like the last few weeks, beginning with some of the brutal attacks on the West Coast targeting Asian Americans, it's been incredibly challenging for a lot of those in the community. It's been hard for us in the newsroom to cover this story, especially for AAPI reporters and editors and correspondents. It's been, a challenge in covering it editorially and trying to separate, our own sort of experience, our own stories, our own sort of processing of these stories and how they impacted us and how we feel about them. I think, that it has, I think, caused a lot of self-reflection. And then, and some surprise. I don't think I've talked to my colleagues within NBC News who are AAPI, this much. In the last month, I've talked to them more than I have in my probably 10 years at NBC News, which is unfortunate and too bad. But I think it also reflects just how, I think, in some ways invisible the kind of bias and or discrimination that we felt as a community, and the lack of conversations we've had in public settings about our own experiences when it comes to race, and discrimination, profiling, perception in America. And so today I would say it's weird. Other times it's been heartbreaking. Other times it's been sad, occasionally scary. And I appreciate you checking in on me on a personal level. And I really have been I've been heartened when colleagues just sort of say, "Hey, how you're doing? How's it going? What are you encountering? What are you dealing with?" I think that actually is just an incredible gesture of allyship that was unexpected as this story really sort of took off, especially in the last few weeks. And of course, since the Atlanta shooting.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and how part of what we're seeing now is just very explicit bias, bias expressed as violence, but how a lot of this bias shows up in much more subtle ways every day in workplaces. And so, as you know, I wrote this book about women and the way that women contend with subtle bias in the form of likability. But one of the things that was always most interesting to me was the way in which gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, parenthood, all of those additional statuses run up and create these more complicated intersections. So for Black women, being assertive is often read as being aggressive or angry, and anger carries this incredible demerit at work. For Latinas like myself, these two different stereotypes, either that we are humble and meek and great worker bees, or that we're all Sofia Vergara in Modern Family and we are passionate and a lot of fun, but maybe not someone who is seen as having leadership potential. professional. And then for Asian and Asian Americans, very often this sense that they are supposed to be submissive. And that is particularly true for Asian American women.
Yeah.
There are all of these studies coming out of Silicon Valley about how even when a large swath of companies' workforce is Asian American women, very rarely do they have women in leadership positions. And I think what's hard about that is it's often happening so subtly that it is hard to know when to call it out. And when you're allowed to say that it's bias. And I wonder for you where that has shown up in your 25 some odd years in media.
And there's a sort of model minority myth, the stereotype that we're successful, hardworking, compliant, keep our heads down, do the hard work. And I certainly have at times, fulfilled that stereotype. I think like only in the last, I would say truly the last few months have I really examined how that could have played a role in my own professional career development, where that may still be playing a role in my today. And I think that, and as you said, like there's very little, I read a study recently, I think it was coming out of Harvard about what's referred to as a bamboo ceiling, the ceiling that Asian Americans may face in the workforce. They only get up to a certain level and they have a hard time going over that. And even if you look at companies like in the Silicon Valley, where you may have a very large number of Asian American managers, mid-career folks, you don't see executives in that same way. And you don't see executives being promoted at the same rates as other groups. And I think that this is where, and then take into account, like, as you said, like, you don't know where to push it. Sometimes the behaviors are so subtle. How much do you push and advocate and sort of say, hey, this is a problem for our company or for my unit or for my team, wherever it might be, and advocate for growing diversity and the fair chance at any kind of promotion or leadership position. I think like ultimately it has to start at the top. It's really hard. I think it has to happen at the executive level. I have just recently been reflecting a lot about, as you know, and some of the folks at NBCU know, our chairman of the news group had announced a 50-50 challenge initiative, that we would be 50% women, 50% people of color across the news group. And I think, in many ways it's pretty extraordinary, because I think that that's what it takes to give everyone permission to also put voice to concerns, feedback, desires, requests, interests, whatever it might be, when it comes to having the same opportunities everyone else should have.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, which is, I think, so much of particularly the lady in the workplace. Like that's how I refer to the genre of work that my book fell under. It has really focused on the individual and what you as an individual can do in order to, what I would say is to survive, not really to thrive in the workplace. And I think what that will take is big structural institutional change that, to your point, comes from the very top and is baked into the institutions. But one thing that I find really helpful to this question of how much individuals should push back or how you push back is a lot of this shows up in feedback sessions, whether that is a really informal feedback session that just sort of happens in a hallway, back when we were together in hallways, or in those, annual sort of sit down, let's review your work, where the vast majority of feedback, especially that women get, is critical subjective feedback, meaning it's feedback on how we hold ourselves, how we use our hands, how we use our voice, how we dress. And that's challenging in a number of ways because you're generally getting someone else's opinion of you. But there was a management coach that I talked to who had this great piece of advice that I think just sort of works in a number of contexts, which is when someone says to you, Catherine, you're a little too assertive, that you ask, okay, compared to whom? Like, who else on the team would you say is I am more or less assertive than? And then the other question that I found really useful is, can you draw a line for me from what you perceive as my style to how it impacts the results of my work? And I think, especially since I know there are a lot of folks on here who are sort of earlier in their careers than we are, I think part of the challenge is you have to be open to the possibility that there is a connection. Right? That I could say, I know you pride yourself on being really meticulous, but sometimes that manifests as indecision. Last week, you were 2 weeks late getting a deck to one of our clients because you couldn't make a decision about slide 7, right? Okay, like now there's a connection between these two things, but very often there isn't. And I think about it now too a lot, and I wonder how you think about this as a manager, where I want to be sure that I am constantly interrogating my own biases and making sure that I'm creating that space for others. So I wonder what that has looked like for you as you have made the transition from someone who is mostly managed to someone who is mostly managing others.
Yeah, no. And, it's fascinating because I was reading your book and I thought like, oh God, women generally are seen as warm and compassionate and, communal. And I thought, God, those are all words that have been used to describe me and my, sort of leadership. And is that good? And is that bad? And I've always had a problem with someone describing me, for instance, as nice. I've just been kind of turned off by that instinctually, which seems like a weird thing to say, but I always felt like, well, that doesn't say anything about my work. It doesn't say anything about my work or the quality of work or my leadership. I think about, likability and looking at traits that make you like someone. I think I'm constantly asking, okay, so and then how does that map up to the work? How does that map up to the outcome or this person's responsibilities? And I think like that's just it's constantly like challenging how you assess people, what you're assessing, and going back to like put this person aside. Here's a work product I need, and then looking at are you getting those deliverables? Are they coming in the way you want it? Like really trying to be very detached from the individual in those circumstances. Obviously, I really care about the people I work with and our colleagues. And that is a given. It's, it's an important sort of principle for me and a value among, as a leader. But I think when you're looking at and assessing talent or contributions, like, to some degree, I really do try to disassociate the person from the product and think about like, here's the outcome, here's the reporting or the journalism or the story, and here are the things that led to its success or maybe its shortcomings.
Yeah, I mean, I think the complexity of all of this is part of the reason I wanted to work with you is because you are so warm, right? Like that may not be traditionally how we have defined leadership, but I am drawn to it, I don't know, magnetically, like a moth to a flame. Like I know that I will show up as the best version of myself as a writer, as a journalist, as a storyteller, if the person who is soliciting that or editing that is creating enough space for me to show up. Right? Like that is the way in which I am more likely to show up as myself. I do wonder, or something I've just been thinking about a lot is, in one context, there's advocating for yourself, the way we think about it in terms of salaries, promotions, titles, and we can get into all of that. But I do also think for those of us who come from what has not been the majority of the workforce in a newsroom, there's always this question of how much we advocate to get stories that are originating from our communities or that reflect our communities into the ether. And I think part of that dance is, on one hand, we want to be seen in our totality and in our complexity as storytellers who could tell any of a variety of stories, but most of us feel, or I think I feel, so I won't say everyone else, but from the vast majority of people I've spoken with, a responsibility to make sure that we bring those stories in while not wanting to ever give the impression that it's the only story we can tell. And I wonder how you make sure that the multiple communities you consider yourself part of are included in our coverage.
Yeah. I mean, we have I think in some ways the advantage, because we have diversity verticals on NBC News Digital, Asian America, Latino, Out, and BLK. And so I think, by the virtue of having these verticals, we've already committed to covering these communities. And we always say we're covering the communities for those in the community and beyond. But I've also stressed, like, these aren't stories just relegated to this vertical. They're stories that travel all over the site and over partners and should be relevant, accessible, interesting, compelling to a broad audience. And so I think to some degree, we've always had an investment in these stories and permission and authority and credibility in these spaces, and we'll continue to serve those communities. But I do think like we're at a time where so many of these stories are big national stories. There's national interest. So, the most read story yesterday on our site was about this unfortunate incident of a 65-year-old Asian American woman who was attacked, viciously in front of a luxury building while some folks watched. And so, and that was a sort of the most read story. Follow-ups on that story today are still doing well. I think it just shows that these are broad, that there's national interest around these stories, interest and understanding. I think that it is hard when these stories don't find big audience, how to keep them out there. But again, we've had a commitment for now several years to really invest in community reporting, so to speak, and really offering what I hope is always high quality, original reporting on topics of interest to, the Asian American community, the Latino American community, you name it. It's been a big sort of part of our newsroom and a core to our coverage. And so I think in some ways we've had that covered. I think what's harder is sort of when these stories seem to not necessarily generate national interest, is to convince editors and others to care about them and find a way in.
Right. I want to ask you about the early part of your career. I am told that you were very shy, which I think is relevant because, again, I think if you are an early career person who is shy, I think you very often get marked as not having it, right? As being like a great person to have on the team, but very often people who are shy are not marked as someone who has leadership potential. And if you're not invested in early and you don't have someone who sort of pushes you through, I think there are a lot of shy, incredible leaders who get overlooked. I wonder, is it that you overcame the shyness, or is it that you found a way to harness it and show up as yourself and make that a part of your leadership style?
Yeah. I think it's a little bit of both. I think, I was very shy growing up, and in early career, I would say like my first few jobs, I felt like, I didn't probably speak up enough and those kinds of things. Some of that's cultural. Some of that is being the only, you talk about this in your book, but it's like when you look around and there's no one else who looks like you, and maybe no one else who's your gender, you tend to feel less confident in that room. I think that, looking back, I think I was surrounded by some really strong women who were at the time producers, senior producers, who were sharp, confident, super creative, strong. And I modeled, everything I sort of did early on was sort of modeling off of their behavior, I think, in many ways. And although I think I was certainly influenced by talented men as well in the room, I think like it was these sort of early female role models, I think, who really helped me along without knowing it. And then I think, separately, I always looked for the things that I could do that were within my power to, expand my skill set, diversify, what I could do to challenge myself. I always wanted a really sharp learning curve. And I remember, especially, sort of in my first 15 years professionally, I always felt like I should be scared to death of the current job. Like that would mean I'm really challenged. I'm going to learn a lot. And every day would be an adventure. That generally was my attitude. And I think it's a combination of overcoming that. I certainly, as a young producer, I wasn't shy about doing the work, out in the field or talking or interviewing folks or doing the research. Like, it wasn't so much that, it was just advocating for myself professionally in my own professional development. And I think that I was fortunate enough that, whether it was a man or a woman, but someone sort of took me along and helped me get to that next step.
Right. And that I think is critical because part of the challenge is I'm a person who wants the work to speak for itself.
Yeah.
That is not always how workplaces work. I mean, the work has to be excellent. You have to show up every day. I think that is sort of the baseline.
Yeah.
But then on top of it, you do need to make sure that people have an understanding of what you're contributing. And I think this is part of where it becomes really difficult if that is not naturally the way you show up in the world, which is especially because if you say, hey, I did this, that can also be met with a penalty, right? Like people can be like, no, we know that's what the money is for. Like you don't need to show up and tell us that. And I think about the early part of my career and I'm the foil to you, which is while I'm very introverted, while I like a lot of time by myself, I'm not particularly shy. And I used to just come in like a wrecking ball. Like I didn't take the time to come in to assess a situation, to learn the cultural nuance of whichever organization or office I was in. And I think there are a lot of times I really missed the mark in my desire to be useful and my desire to contribute maximally. There were finer points that I was missing. And I do wish I would have done a little bit more of what you seem to have been doing, which is to hang back just a touch, to watch and to learn, and then to then go full throttle.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that has been for me part of my professional learning curve is learning that you don't have to come in with a bang on day one.
I think, I mean, there's so much I wish I knew back then, that I think I can identify now. I mean, the other thing I would say to young people is like, find people who are really smart that you can learn from around you. And I always had this attitude, like, if I didn't feel like I was learning from people around me, then I felt like it was time to move on. And I think, that I think still holds true to me. I think it's served me well. But I would say to young people now, don't be afraid to ask for advice. Don't be afraid to find and seek out mentors. In a perfect world, we're all looking at places where people in leadership positions, managerial positions, are looking to help nurture and grow talent. And if you don't have that, you are handicapped in a competitive environment. So I think like my advice is just be a little bit more aggressive about that and look for, and who cares? Like go out and try to get that meeting with someone you don't know, but that you want to get to know.
Right. I think about this a lot in the context of mentorship and sponsorship. So I think there were a lot of us who were raised to believe that if we could just find the right mentor, it would be like a fairy godmother or the Wizard of Oz, where they would like pull back a curtain, then our career would be waiting for us there, which I don't think is exactly how it works.
This mentor isn't working for me. Yeah.
Everything could have been expedited. But the difference really quickly between a mentor and a sponsor is that a mentor gives you great feedback, great advice, but a sponsor really goes to the mat for you. And a sponsor can be someone inside your organization. I think in my case, it has benefited me most when it's someone inside my organization. It can also be someone inside your industry, but it's someone who has a big Rolodex who wants to use it and leverage it on your behalf. And it is a reciprocal relationship. So you're bringing something to the relationship. So, in my case, it might be, I come from a background where I've done organizing, generational organizing. I've done organizing in the Latinx community. So I have a knowledge of those demographics that I bring with me into everything that I do, in addition to my lived experience. That's something that I can offer someone in exchange. But that person really does, if they're inside your organization, put you on stretch assignments. They say your name in meetings where, that she's ready to be a senior VP. Oh, we have a job opening. No, it has to be her. And I think that there are a lot of us who have cheerleaders, and cheerleaders are incredible. But you also need someone who just fundamentally pushes you through.
Yeah.
And that I think is, when I look at people who are lateral to me and their careers, a lot of the people who have had the most satisfying and robust ascensions have been people who really had that person advocating for them. Because while of course you have to advocate for yourself, I do think that sometimes there are limits to the way in which that is effective.
Yeah. I think that's true. And the other thing is, pushing people forward that you believe are going to be successful, even if they haven't necessarily demonstrated the ability to do that job. And we always talk about that, when we think about like just promotions and advancement in the workplace, that women have to be ready. Men get to make the jump, they get the leap of faith. women are tested, and reviewed and analyzed and assessed. I think like in the ways in which we can give everyone that opportunity to stretch, to give, the leap of faith assignment to say like, I have, plenty of evidence that suggests this person will be great, but do we know for sure? No. Do I think it's worth it? Yes. Taking those chances and and making those things happen. I think that, I try to look at like, things like how we are, who's the right candidate for this job, and not just thinking about like the traditional things that you might look at,
Yes.
expertise, experience. I look at like what other kind of things dimensionally are value add, perspective, lived experience, temperament, investment, and I think those are really important, because you don't want a one for one. When I'm promoting, I don't want just like the person who checks all the boxes in the traditional sense. I want like a exponential add in that promotion and this kind of magnifying effect. And that's what I look for. And I think like when you really expand sort of your lens and what's going to be the biggest value that you can create with bringing this person from this level to that level, like I think like truly looking at the sort of 360 is critical.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question that you may not have at the ready, that you may not have the answer at the ready. So I will share mine so you can collect yourself, which is, so when you look back at that early part of your career, a mistake that you feel that you made as it relates specifically to advocating for yourself. So I'll give you mine. And I thought about this a lot because it showed up when I was writing the likability trap, which is that in feedback sessions with women, very often they tend to skew positive, that there is a resistance to giving women really like tough, critical feedback on their work itself, on their work product. And that may sound nice, like it's nice to go into a feedback session where everyone's like, no, you're great, A+ across the board. But I realized that I had some of those feedback sessions when I was earlier in my career. And I was just so happy to be given a gold star that I didn't do the next step, which is just say, I'm really glad that you're happy with the way I'm performing. What could I be doing even better? How do I grow inside this organization? How can we work together to create those opportunities to tell new stories, to do new things? And that in just sort of being happy to have had a good feedback session, I often wasn't actually getting anything out of them other than the sugar high of being told, that I was appreciated. I wonder for you, what you think about from those years.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Just earlier today, I was talking to a young female reporter who was seeking out some advice, and I was giving her, some just some ideas, some things to think about, some calls to make, and meetings to set up. And the one thing I said is, go talk to this person, but tell them you don't want a job. You just want their advice. You want just hard, kind of critical feedback on your work. And I was trying to say, like, remove everything that would make this person feel socially like they had to be a little bit nicer to you, or, oh, they're balancing like your desire to get a job out of this. Just remove everything and just ask this person for just pure feedback, critical feedback. And I think that I wish I would have had that, early on in my career. I think the best feedback I got happened a little later, and that was, understand your power. And I think, this was a particular manager who said, like, you don't understand the power you wield, the position you have, the voice you have, and your ability to influence and make change. And I thought that was really important, but that happened so late. I wish I would have heard those things.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. It also just takes me back to a piece of advice I always give, because I also wish someone had given this to me, which was, help me help you. Like, if you're going to come to me and ask me to be helpful, I love nothing more than being helpful, but I need you to spell out for me how you would like me to be helpful. So not even like, can you introduce me to some people? It's like, I've looked through your LinkedIn contacts. here are the 3 people I would like you to, here's the draft email, just like constantly pushing it forward. I mean, I don't know about you. I mean, I have 2 kids. I've been in quarantine now for a year, working. My spouse also works. I'm under a pile of email. I will never get out from under this pile of email. I hate to be this person. Like, you have to email me 4 to 5 times.
Yes.
If you're like, especially if it's like, you are not my direct manager or my best friend, like, I'm going to need like an SOS at the top of the email. And I think that is something I didn't understand when I used to go to people, because I was worried about being a nuisance. And I was worried. And yes, you have to read the room. And like, comes a point where a person doesn't want to help, can't help, doesn't have the capacity. I've also learned that's often not personal. It really is about the other person's capacity. I think my baby's screaming as if on cue to that note. But here's my final question for you, which is, and then I'll share mine with you, which is there something you've done or a practice you've done that you wish you had begun earlier in your career that you feel would have helped you?
Yeah, I think it is exactly that, which is advocating for oneself. Like, I do really feel like if that was the one thing someone would have told me 15 years ago or 20 years ago, I think that's just so critical. And then I think you're right. Like, just, people who are in positions like mine or yours, like, we're juggling a million different things, family, caregiving, work, email. Under the pandemic, it feels like work never ends, all sorts of things. So like, don't feel hurt or insulted, or even like you're being a burden when you're badgering someone for advice or for a conversation or a meetup. And I think that when you come to those, feel free. Like, I personally think it's faster. Like, let's get down to business. Like, tell me exactly what you know about yourself and don't know about yourself, or where you want to go, or how lukewarm you feel about this profession, or whatever it might be. And that gives me exactly what I need to know to try to help you get to a better place. And I think, like, of course, you hope you can trust the folks you reach out to and they don't hold it against you that you don't have all the answers. I think most won't, because we can all look back at how little we knew, 10 years ago or 15 years ago or whatever it might be. But I think, like, the biggest advice I would give is to advocate for yourself and seek out advice, seek out people who will be sponsors, who will be mentors, seek out peers who are your support network, who can help you out. I think, like, there is there's so much that we can learn, from dialogue and from conversations, and we all know this. And yet sometimes it's like the one thing we don't do to advance our careers. We don't have the conversations. We don't do the research. We don't sort of try to figure out and try to connect these dots. And to me, like, I always look back and think, like, if I would have known that, I probably would have gotten here faster. I probably would have done that sooner. Or I probably would have had that opportunity that I wanted at the time. Now maybe don't, but, will regret that I never pursued. So I think, like, again, advocating early for yourself, finding people you trust, creating a network, and not having any hangups about that. That would be my advice.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I sometimes remember people, like, it can be a text chain. It can be a WhatsApp chat. Like, it can be, I think it's people who are lateral to you and people who sort of see you and get you in your complexity and in your potential, right? Someone who's like, she may not be there yet, but she can go there. And I think those people are really important for gut checks, right? Like, I think part of it is that I think in the early part of my career, a lot of that was like friends who were like, you go girl friends.
Yeah.
Which is important. Like, everybody needs that, but you also need someone where you can say, this was the feedback I got. Does this comport with how you know me to be? And where that person can be like, yeah, sometimes you shrink the meeting. Yeah. Sometimes you think products need to be iterative when really people want a final draft. Like, there are a million versions of this, but you want someone who can really say, yes, sounds like you, or no, this doesn't. Yeah.
I think it's so important. And I even to this day, I think it's hard to get critical, constructive feedback. But it is exactly the information you want to sort of keep on moving ahead, to sort of like, what are my blind spots? Tell me, like, don't leave me in the dark any longer.
I know. I feel like I just need to tell people, it's like, I will cry as you give me this critical feedback, but know that I'm appreciating it.
Exactly. I might get mad inside, but yeah, exactly. But it's like, you know, we're all here to, you know, to sort of improve what we do every day, I hope, you know, and to give back in all the ways we know and want to. But I think like that, like asking for what you want, I always say to everyone on my team, like, you should always ask. Like, the answer might be no. The answer may be, I can't address that now. You know, it may not be the answer you want, but you won't know until you ask.
Okay. Did I miss anything that was mission critical?
I don't think so. I think that, you know, well, there was one other thing I think like that helps in advocating for oneself and in career development overall. And that is, I think, and I'm starting to think about this a lot, especially with the sort of the reckoning that's happening in the Asian American community. And that is like being authentic to yourself and finding your voice and feeling comfortable. I think that leads to an enormous amount of confidence, and takes a lot of the sort of the other stuff out of the room. And it's hard to do, but you know, 15, 20 years ago, if you were talking about the Asian American community, you know, it was like you were lauded for assimilating really well, you know? And I think that in some ways, like all those conversations about assimilation for at least a swath of my generation was all about sort of, yeah, that's great. You have this other culture at home, but you can leave that there. Like, we want you to like assimilate with everyone else, you know, like, and I think there was an erasing and invisibility, like all sorts of things came about because of that. And to some degree, and I can't help but think that probably had to color my own identity, public identity and professional identity. And I think like, to me, sort of one way that you become more confident, that you can give back more, you can aspire for more, you can be more successful, is just like being comfortable with who you are, being authentic to yourself, finding your voice, and trying to, even if you're self-examining, oh, should I have done that? Should I have done, like, try to ignore that and just kind of move forward. And it's okay to fumble along.
Well, this has been very cathartic for me. I hope that everyone watching got something out of it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It's great seeing you, Alicia.
I know, this is like a fun
someday
soon we were overdue for.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so to those of you watching, I hope you have enjoyed this as much as I did. I hope you've learned something. And if you're interested in more live streams and videos about journalism and news, you can visit us at NBCUacademy.com. Follow us on social media. As you can see, I'm very reliant on my prompter. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye, everyone. Bye.